Who has the advantage? The sword and buckler user or the sabre using a sabre? Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now, those who follow the channel regularly will know that I've done a few related videos recently talking about the Indian tulwar, which is this sword here, and also I showed a lesson that we did 2 years ago for the Drain event, where we looked at a Victorian manual, The Swordsman by Captain Alfred Hutton of 1897, talking about how a person using a sabre could go up against, that's one of these, could go up against someone fighting with a tulwar or pulwar and a shield or dal like this one here, Indian shield. In this case, similar ones were used in Afghanistan. And quite simply, these techniques were devised for the European swordsmen to use their single sabre successfully, or at least try to use them successfully, against the person using the sword and buckler. And this inevitably gives rise to the question, which many people in the comments underneath asked, who actually has the advantage in reality between the sword and buckler and the single sabre? Well, on the surface of it, this seems a very, very simple question, and we could simply end the video here by going, well, of course, you nincompoop, the person with a sword and buckler has an advantage over the person with the single sabre. And generally speaking, I'd say that's true. However, it's a far more complicated question than that. And in actual fact, there are some advantages that the person with the single sabre has, even though I would say, and I want to say this at the outset, if you only have a single sabre and the other person has a sword and a buckler, in general, it is fair to say that the person with the sword and buckler does have an advantage. But as regular viewers of this channel will know, I am all about the context. That's why I'm known as Captain Context. And quite simply, you have to think, well, why is the person using a single sabre? And there are various answers to that question. However, by and large, the answer is this. The answer is that the reason the person has one sword and doesn't have a buckler in their other hand is because their other hand is being used for other things, primarily, not always, but primarily firearms. Now, we also have to say, I think there's a lot of people from the modern world, particularly shooters, who think that the gun is the be-all and end-all because they're familiar with modern firearms reliability, accuracy, magazine capacity, so on and so forth. And you have to remember that the firearms of the time, I mean, if we go back earlier, you're talking about single-shot flintlocks, then single-shot percussion locks, and then even by the time we get to the revolver, you're talking about 5 or 6 shots. And yes, some people carried 2 revolvers. Barely anyone carried more than that. But you have to bear in mind, as I've pointed out in previous videos, in most cases, a British officer, for example, in India or China or Afghanistan or North Africa, would only have 1 revolver, and British revolvers, generally speaking, only have 5 shots for various reasons we can deal with in another video. But therefore, you've only got 5 shots, and you don't really, charging into a building or in the middle of a melee, you don't have time to reload. Not when people are swinging swords at your head and trying to stab you with spears and all that kind of stuff. You have basically only got the 5 shots you've got here. Now, of those 5 shots, it's very likely that all 5 shots will not be effective, either because they miss or because they don't stop the opponent. So, once this is out of the game, theoretically you could possibly use it as a bludgeoning instrument or throw it or possibly occasionally block things with it, but by and large you're left with this. And that's the reason that certainly within British and French and Spanish colonial warfare, swords were still very important, because if people are trying to kill you with swords, knives, spears, maces, axes, things like this, then swords are very, very useful because they don't run out of ammunition. You've still got a gun anyway, it's not an either-or situation, you've still got a gun, you use the gun. When the gun runs out of ammunition or a person gets too close for it to be useful, then the sword is still useful. And also remember, the sword can block, and this was actually done by von Tempsky's Rangers when fighting the Maoris in New Zealand. The hand weapon was very often used to block, while the firearm was allowed therefore to shoot. So if a person comes very close to you, you can literally parry their attack and blast them in the face at the same time. So the two things can be used very effectively together. However, if we now assume that the firearm has been expended, this is now empty, you've done with it whatever you want to do, you are only left with this. Is this at a massive disadvantage compared to the sword and buckler? Well, actually this matter is somewhat more complicated and subtle, and a lot of people who don't fence, or at least haven't fenced single sword against sword and buckler, wouldn't necessarily be able to guess the answers to this. So in as concise a way as possible, I will explain them to you according to my opinions and my experience. First of all, yes, I have fenced single sabre or single sword, in some cases side sword, against sword and buckler. Lots and lots and lots of times over the course of many, many years. Are you at a massive disadvantage? No, actually. And there's a few reasons for that. One is you're only holding one weapon, so your brain, it can now devote more of its energy to doing things with that weapon, feints, parries, so on and so forth. So your brain isn't divided between two things, it's focused on one thing. That's the first thing. The second one is somewhat more physical, and that is that if you only have a single weapon, you can more easily present one side forward and engage that weapon at maximum reach. You'll notice a sword, which is in my hand, is attached to my arm, which is attached to my shoulder. Therefore, I can use lunge and recover footwork, keeping my opponent far, far away from my body. So whether it's a rapier, a sabre, or whatever else, an arming sword, because we're holding it in one hand here, it means that the whole other side of my body is far away from my opponent and a narrow target, just as in modern Olympic fencing. As soon as we pick up a sword and buckler and start using passing footwork, we spend more of our time with our body and both our arms in range of the opponent. So we are a bigger target. We've got twice as many arms are in range to hit. And very often our body is more square on and a wider target, and very often we're changing feet. And we're not usually using lunge and recover footwork. Now we could use sabre strategy and fence right side forward and just keep the buckler back in defence, and that would be one thing. That's not normally what people do with sword and bucklers, and it basically robs you of the advantages of the buckler. So while the sword and buckler is advantageous, if you take the buckler out of play, at this point it becomes like a piece of armour. Yes, you could just protect your head with it, or you could protect your chest with it, and it might do some added benefit in that way, but you're robbing it of a lot of its benefits. So, for those two reasons, the single sword isn't that far behind the sword and buckler. But there's another very important reason, and this is very, very pertinent to the lesson that I showed in the previous video. And this, actually, I answered this in the comments against underneath people who basically pointed this out. So a lot of people pointed out that in the demonstration, the training partner, who in that case was Pedro, was being compliant, and that is true. We also do loads of sparring and loads of non-compliant stuff, but when you're teaching a lesson and when you're demonstrating, there is most martial arts do it, there is a huge advantage to demonstrating with a compliant opponent so that you can show the theory of what you're trying to do. Obviously in a real fight they will start to do other things, and so at the moment they cut and I parry and I start to go for that grab, yes, they might try and slug me with the buckler, or they might try and even hit my hand with the buckler, or do various other things, try and twist their arm out of the grip and these kind of things. So absolutely, yes, there's always a counter to a counter to a counter to a counter. That's how fights, that's how martial arts work. However, for demonstration and explanation purposes, you usually show it with a person going, okay, they do A, I do B, they might do C, and I do D. And that's how you explain, that's how you teach. It's the same thing with maths or English in a classroom with children. Okay, same principle. However, let's think about this for a second. So all of those techniques that Alfred Hutton devised, well, he didn't really devise them. He took them from George Silver's manual of 1599, and so therefore they're Elizabethan or Tudor techniques. Okay, so Hutton didn't actually devise them. Hutton took them from the grips and closes of George Silver and then adapted them to the military sabre and imagined the opponent to be an Afridi tribesman with a tulwar and a buckler. Now, what we're principally dealing with here is a parry, okay? The opponent attacks and you parry it. And I think everybody agrees that if someone swings a sword at you, apart from stepping out of the way, which takes you out of the fight, means you're not close enough to hit them back, the best way to deal with an attack is to parry it and riposte, okay? In this case, rather than parry and riposte, what we're actually doing, if we switch to the sabre, is we are parrying, grabbing, riposting. Parry, grab, riposte. Parry, grab, riposte. Parry, grab, riposte. Parry, grab, riposte. Whatever it is, it's a parry, grab, riposte. Okay, so it's 3 movements. If you look at Filipino martial arts, they do something very, very similar to this. And in fact, if you look at most martial arts, Japanese, Chinese, whatever, Indian, you'll find very, very similar things. So the grab is super important. Now, this is where the other massive advantage of only having one weapon in one hand comes in. You still got a hand, okay? Yes, indeed, I might not have a buckler in this hand, but if you've got a buckler, there is only one commonly found grab in sword and buckler systems, okay? And that is an arm wrap, because it's just about the only type of command on the opponent's sword arm that you can do with a buckler or shield in your hand. If you're holding a buckler or a shield, yes, a buckler or a shield is fantastic and very useful in defense and offense and gives you lots of advantages, but the one thing it robs you of is the ability to grab properly. One of the great things about having only a sabre and not having a pistol in your hand, because maybe you've shot 5 people with it already, is that when you parry that opponent's blow here, okay, you've got the left hand to now grab their sword arm or do something, do whatever. You could just slug them in the face, do whatever, but grab if you can. And that means that their weapon arm is grabbed. Okay, now think about this purely on paper. If you get that grab on, if you get the parry, if you get the grab, where does that leave you? That leaves you in a position whereby their weapon arm is grabbed and controlled and they can't freely use their sword. Your weapon is free to use. So it's a sort of perfect scenario if you can do it. And I'm not saying it's easy, but we do it in sparring. Lots. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at rapier, small sword, medieval longsword, langmesser, sabre, backsword. All systems across centuries in Europe have grabs and wraps and things like this. So in other words, controls on the opponent's weapon arm. Not only do you find it in Europe, you find it in Japan, you find it in China, you find it in India, you find it all over. So to parry an opponent's attack and then grab their weapon arm, if you can do it, is great, because your weapon's now free and theirs isn't. Now, a lot of people have said, at the point of that grab, wouldn't they try and use their shield against you? Yes, they might, okay, absolutely. So if I am now the Afridi tribesman and I've come in and I've done a big old slash at that British officer's head, boom, and he parries it, oh no, and he grabs my arm, oh no, I might go bang with my shield into his face. Yes, absolutely. No question whatsoever, that is a valid thing to do. However, at that moment, whilst I can bash him with my shield, with the rim or the front, and that's a good thing to do in my situation, okay, because I've had my arm grabbed and my weapon's not free, that might enable me to free up this arm and be able to get another cut at him, which is great. But you have to remember, let's turn the tables now. What's he just done? He just parried my blow, grabbed my sword arm, okay? Now, I'm about to get slugged in the face from a shield. Well, first of all, a shield is relatively easy to block with any bit of your body, okay? You can just stick the arm in the way, okay? So if I'm here having parried and grabbed, okay, and a shield starts coming in from here, all I really need to do is get my arm in the way, and the worst that's going to happen is I'm going to get a bruise in my arm. Really, the shield blow, whether the front or the edge, assuming it doesn't have any spikes or anything like that on it, the only thing it can really hurt is my face and head, okay? When I say hurt, I mean injure. Yes, it might hurt my arm, my elbow, my shoulder, my ribs, but it's only going to bruise them. It's not going to put me out of the fight. So the problem is, yes, he can give me a blow with the shield, but I can also block it fairly easily. And the one really important thing is I still have a grab on the weapon arm and my weapon is free, okay? So, while the Afridi tribesman has gone, oh, I'm going to take your head off, bam, it got parried. And then I'll try and come in and give a blow, okay? The person using the sabre is going to go do their parry. Let's do a parry this way this time. I'm gone for the grab. Oh, that blow's coming at my head. Oh, I'll just stick my arm in the way here. Bam, ow, that hurt my elbow a bit, but my weapon's still free. Stab, 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 hit. Okay, this weapon is still free. So yes, the shield person can give me a blow with the shield, but my edges, front and back edges, my point, my pommel, my hilt, all of it is still free to attack and still deal with that opponent who all they've got free to use is just a buckler. I hope that's thought-provoking. I do want to just come all the way back to the beginning and say that overall, in a fight, a person's sword and buckler versus single sword does have an advantage, but it's nowhere near as big as you might think, okay? The fact is, with the single sword, not only do you have all sorts of advantages with the way you hold the weapon and use the weapon, but you also still have a hand, and that hand's super useful. And if you can get a grab on the opponent's weapon arm, in that moment, if you don't mess up, in that moment, you have a free weapon to stab and cut and pommel and do whatever you like with. They can't use their weapon, they've only got their buckler. Right, and of course, context as always. The reason for not carrying a buckler around is that you can more easily use a firearm, which by the time of multi-shot firearms is a bigger advantage than carrying a buckler. One person did comment that there are records of Europeans carrying bucklers in India, and that is true. However, the examples I've seen are earlier. They're before revolvers came in, and so they're when people had single shot pistols. So in that case, it might be advantageous to have a pistol, wear the buckler hanging off your belt or whatever, use the pistol, and then once you've used the pistol, then get the buckler out and use it thereafter. When you've got multiple shot pistols, I think it probably makes more sense to keep the pistol in your hand, because you can shoot one person, then use the sword, and then shoot another couple of people, or whatever you need to do. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting and thoughtful and useful. Comments, views, opinions, opposing opinions, arguments, very welcome to post below. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.